Welcome to the Line Haul Playbook. I'm your host, Emily Blair. Joining me in my virtual studio today is Joel Tovi of Robertson Ryan Insurance. Joel, thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely. I'm really happy to be here. And I think we have a lot of really helpful information that we'll be able to share with the network today. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. I am excited too, and we are going to dive straight into the meat here. Workers' compensation. It is
Yes.
such a scary, scary thing when you receive a claim. Can you talk to us about what advice you have for a TSP that receives a claim?
Sure, absolutely. Emily, it can be very scary, but with a little bit of information and a little bit of planning, it makes going through that process a lot easier. One of the things that's very important about workers' comp claims is to make sure that they get filed as quickly as possible because let's be honest, people are very litigious nowadays, and so it's just important to make sure that those claims get reported as quickly as possible. Here's an important piece. Communication between the carrier and the contractor needs to be flowing really well. So if you have an insurance adjuster that's being told one thing by the driver and being told something different by the AO or the agent, that adjuster is going to want to talk directly to the AO to get the straight story on what's going on. So if you have an adjuster that's reaching out over and over and they're not able to reach somebody to answer those questions, that can definitely cause some problems. Another important thing to do would be to manage, the driver's expectations on how that's going to be handled. So, if the driver comes to you and like, hey, I've hurt my wrist, if you already know your steps of process on how to handle that claim and you can say, okay, here's our policy information, here's our agent, here's Joel's information. If you can hand them that and then send them to urgent care or the emergency room, they feel like they're being taken care of. And then let them know an adjuster or somebody on Joel's team is going to be in touch with you to ask additional questions. That's one of the things that I've noticed with drivers sometimes is they don't understand that somebody's going to call them and ask them some questions about what happened because the details matter in a claim.
That makes a lot of sense. One thing you mentioned to me that I want to ask you to clarify, different states have different regulations as far as, what is required of the employer, what is required of the employee. Where can you find that kind of information?
So all of that information will be available on your state insurance commissioner's website. But the thing to keep in mind is that as a contractor for FedEx, there are going to be requirements that they have for you specifically. And those requirements are going to be the first and most important thing that we look at. But as a contractor, always remember you have to comply with what FedEx wants you to carry, not just what the state minimums are.
Very good. And for the workers' compensation, I heard a horror story one time from a contractor who told me that they had grown a lot in their first year of business. And at the end of that first year, they received a workers' compensation insurance bill that almost took them out of business. How does that happen and how do you prevent it?
One of the things that we like to do is we connect our insureds, our contractors, with programs that are pay as you go. So the old way, someone would take an estimate of what their payroll would be for the year. Let's say the policy's $30,000, and they would just break it up into 12 equal payments. That works, except with FedEx contractors, we all know payroll goes up and down, right? First quarter of the year, after peak, it's very, very slow. It scales up. You hit peak season, payroll figures go up. What happens if somebody gets some additional, area codes, or somebody gets some new runs and they grow dramatically halfway through the year? What's important about the pay-as-you-go programs is that It allows you to pay exactly what you owe each month. So at the end of that policy period, the audit is just, just pushing a button, everything lines up because you paid accurate amounts all year long. So it keeps you from, I've seen people get audits that are 50 or $60,000. I've heard of audits over $100,000. And it's because when that policy was originally set up, they set somebody up with an old school policy and now they're getting hit with one of those audits, and it's frustrating because it's very easy to do it a different way. So hopefully people take away from that that's something they need to consider is a pay as you go policy.
You had mentioned that you had a couple items that you recommend
Hmm.
as options that employers choose to do when leave is required. Can
Hmm.
you share some of those tips with our audience?
Yes, so there's something called light duty. And so if you have a driver that has been injured, but the doctor, and this is important, the doctor has cleared them for light duty, what some contractors will do, instead of putting that driver out on the road, they'll have them work in the office, do some paperwork, something that's light duty. What's important about that is it keeps the driver from being at home collecting, indemnity payments every week from the carrier. It's important because when your mod score, and we'll get into the mod score in just a minute, when your mod score is calculated, when they see indemnity payments, that is weighed more heavily than medical payments because that means, the employee is at home, they're not doing anything, they're just collecting a check. So, amongst going to their doctor's visits and doing the steps that they need to be doing. So, yeah, it's definitely something to consider is light duty. I've heard some creative ideas. We had a contractor that their driver got light duty and they sent them to the local Goodwill. And the driver was like, "Why am I going to Goodwill?" And they're like, "You're going to volunteer today and you're wearing one of our shirts when you do it." You know what I mean? So there are some creative things when you think outside the box that can be very beneficial.
That is great. And let's go back to that mod score. Can you
Mm.
explain what the mod score is?
Sure. So you can think of the mod score as kind of like your credit score for your operation. So that mod score is calculated by the National Council on Compensation Insurance. They're a third party. They're a nonprofit organization. They've been around for over 100 years, and they collect data from all of these different states. They collect all this claims information and they put it all together, and then they advise on the types of rates that carriers are going to charge for workers' comp. Now, that being said, something to keep in mind is that NCCI is not in all states. And so, California comes to mind, North Carolina comes to mind, Michigan. These are all states where they have their own bureau within the state that calculates a mod score. So NCCI has most states, but they don't have all states. Just something to keep in mind because I know we have people from all over the country that'll be watching. But that mod score, it starts as a 1.0. I'm going to get a little nitty gritty here. It starts as a 1.0, Emily, but it can go up. I've seen contractors that had mod scores over a 2.0, and I've seen them as low as a 0.60. And the way that works is, let's say you're paying $1 for every $100 of payroll, and you run a really tight ship, and so you haven't had any claims or they've been very small, and you have a 0.60 mod score. That means you get 40% off. So when that mod score is applied to your policy, you're only going to have to pay 60 cents per $100 of payroll as opposed to a dollar. Or in some cases, unfortunately for some people, with a 2.0, they're paying double their rates that they should be. So, and the vast majority of carriers apply that mod score. It's pretty standardized across the country.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I often see contractors wondering if they're paying too much for workers'
Hmm.
compensation. So that's a great tip to have. Thank you.
Yeah, with a mod score, there's a few things to keep in mind. Frequency of claims. Okay, that's definitely something that gets calculated into the mod score. So if you're having 6 or 8 claims a year, even if they're only a few $1,000s each time, when NCCI sees that, they think about it this way. Well, if they're having 6 or 8 small claims a year, it's only a matter of time until we get a catastrophic claim because they see that frequency. And so they'll think to themselves, or they use algorithms now for all of this stuff, but it'll look like this is a little bit more dangerous risk because they're having a lot of frequency. Now the flip side of that is uh, if you have a claim that's significant, say a claim that's a couple $100,000, that'll still be weighed. It's still weighed heavily, but underwriters tell me all the time. They say, "Hey, look, we're reviewing these loss runs, this historical record of losses for this policy, and they've got 4 years that look great, but we have this one claim that's $125,000. We're going to try to get an exception on that, or we're going to try to not weigh that quite as heavily when we're preparing, an offering or they're preparing a quote." So there's a lot of different things that go into it. It's kind of nuanced, but um, hopefully that gives you a little bit more information.
Yeah, that's great. I really appreciate that. I think that's a great overview of workers'
Yeah.
compensation. Let's go ahead and move on to the EPLI.